Hello, my name is Chantal Chagnon. I am the CEO for the Green Party Calgary Centre, as well as on a number of the Green Party committees on the federal level. I am also very actively involved with the Idle No More here in Calgary. I think it's really important that people know their rights, know the legislation, and know exactly what's happening to their environment and to their human rights, as well as to their children's future. And Brian.
Right. Well, my name is Brian Seaman, and I am a human rights and civil liberties lawyer here in Calgary, and a friend of Chantal's. And I was so glad to see the Idle No More movement arise back in December, because unlike most Canadians, I suspect, I do have an interest in First Nations issues and environmental issues, and I'm probably one of the few Canadians who actually took the time to read the omnibus bills, Bill C-38 and C-45, when they were first introduced into Parliament over a year ago by the Harper government. And I saw the writing on the wall. I knew what was at stake here. I thought this was an indirect and insidious and sneaky way to go about erasing First Nations rights.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do rise at this time to put forward a motion that this House do now adjourn under the provisions of Standing Rule 52 in order to take up the pressing issue of the Canada-China Investment Treaty. Just my office alone, Mr. Speaker, I've now received over 64,000 individual messages from Canadians asking that this matter be stopped or at least debated before Canadians find themselves bound to it.
To me, it was the white paper of '69 all over again. And what also struck me was reading about how the Harper government had all of a sudden removed from environmental protection thousands and thousands of inland lakes, waterways, river deltas, watersheds. And the question that was begged in my mind was, well, why? And it was obvious to me. They wanted to remove these waterways from environmental oversight, and indeed even gut environmental regulations, and politicize the process and make the cabinet the final arbiter in environmental approval processes to benefit mining companies and oil extraction enterprises and pipelines. And then when I read the FIPPA Pact with China back in late November, to me that was the final nail in the coffin. It was obvious to me what was going on. The Harper government, aligned with capital from China and other places, wanted to essentially gut the environmental regulations and allow corporations to operate basically with impunity in Canada's north.
Like the elders always said, once you kill that water, there's nothing there, you know. The life of the water's dead.
We're literally dying right now. Cancers are destroying our people in numbers that the Centers for Disease Control can't even explain it.
But, you know, I was feeling sick, but I thought, you know, what can I do as a sole person, even with my legal training? And so I made a few calls to constitutional law experts I know, and constitutional lawyers, and even people who are connected with political circles. I said, do you know anybody who can do something about this? And no, sorry, I don't see how we can do anything. I mean, the federal government has the power to make a treaty with a foreign power. But I did know a little bit of Aboriginal law at that time, and I knew that there was one group of people who could do something about this, and that was our First Nations people. So when I read back in January that 3 bands, 2 in Alberta and 1 in British Columbia, the 2 in Alberta being Mikisew Cree and Frog Lake First Nations, were taking the federal government to court over the omnibus bills, and that in British Columbia, a small band called the Hupachassath First Nation in Port Alberni, British Columbia, was taking the federal government to court over this FIPPA Pact with China.
Hello everyone, my name is Brenda Sayers and I'm elected councillor, and I am here today on behalf of Hupachassath First Nation regarding the Canada-China Foreign Investment Promotion and Protection Agreement, also known as the FIPPA. This agreement is sitting on Prime Minister Stephen Harper's desk, waiting for approval by Cabinet.
to
After
do something
approval,
and offer
diplomatic
my services in whatever way I could to anyone, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, non-native, who wanted speaking, wanted to hear more about FIPPA and the horrible thing it was doing to First Nations sovereignty, Canadian sovereignty. I wanted to offer my services as a speaker, and so.
I think it's really important that you've been speaking out about this legislation and about the bills. You've been really addressing the legal aspects of it that a lot of people really didn't know about. And what surprises me that a lot more people aren't standing up against this. But I think it's baby steps. We've been going into schools, we've been going into different community organizations, whether they be Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, and just having these conversations and letting people know what's happening with these bills, letting people know the impact that this is really having.
Hello, welcome to NTD News. I'm Lena Berezovska. Today, the mandatory 21 sitting days ended for the controversial Canada-China trade agreement. If ratified, it will lock Canada into a 31-year deal with China that critics argue will favor Beijing and potentially waste taxpayers' money. And the opposition is saying they will not allow it. Here are the details.
Canada's investment
When
treaty
the
with
omnibus
China
bill,
is at the end of its waiting
Bill
period.
C-38
The
first came out,
opposition is left.
I started to get nervous because I started to see all these
Yeah.
years and years and years of fantastic environmental protection and legislation that really, Canada was on top of the world with that before. We were, best in show, so to speak. And that bill came out and I started shaking. I was like, oh, that's not good. I started feeling sick to my stomach reading through it. And there was so much in there that you couldn't even get through it. And then Bill C-45 came in. And with that Navigable Waters Act being destroyed, it was like nail in the coffin, see you later environment.
Someone really doesn't like fresh water. Now, I admit I am biased here. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm a drinker. I drink water at home, at work, heck, I put it in my coffee. But to me, this goes to the very heart of who we are. When I think about what makes Canada great, fresh water...
The Conservative majority, even though they had, less than 38% of the popular vote in the last election.
Of the people who voted.
Yeah.
If you count the people who didn't vote, they actually only got the votes of about 25% of Canadians.
Actually probably a lot less than
Or
that.
even less, yeah.
Probably, I'd say probably about 18, maybe 19% max of total Canadians. I mean, that just goes to show that our system is broken. Our democratic system is broken. And it's because it's based on the kind of Confederate model of, that hierarchy of the Queen and then the justices and then so on and so forth.
According to a recent Dominion Institute poll, a majority of Canadians have no idea how Parliament works. But we took solace in the fact that we are one of the greatest democracies on this earth, and at least we know who is ultimately in charge. Well, not really. When asked who is Canada's head of state, 75% of Canadians could not answer the question. And who can blame them? The answer is ridiculous. It is the Queen of England. Now, for those of you unaware of her work, she's an elderly lady of German descent who lives in a castle across the ocean. In fact, in order to become a Canadian citizen, you must swear an oath of loyalty to the Queen and her heirs. Luckily, I was born here, so I've never had to do it.
That doesn't function anymore. It's a dysfunctional society because people feel like their voice isn't going to be heard, so they don't go bother to vote. And that's one thing that I always stress when I speak to people, is your vote does matter. Your vote is your voice. And if you don't put that voice on the table, well, you can't really bitch. That's my favorite saying. If you don't vote, you can't bitch. And I loves to bitch. But it really bothers me that the government has really taken advantage of that. They've taken advantage of apathy. And what we're seeing now with Bill C-45 is it started to mess with trees. And as soon as you start to mess with trees, well, people got their back up. And they're like, wait a second. So these things that have been in place far beyond this government, whether it be majority or minority, it doesn't matter. Far beyond these people or even these generations. This is going back 4, 5, 6, 7 generations that these laws are being destroyed, the sovereignty is being destroyed, that environmental protection and legislation is being destroyed. Our way of life was already destroyed, whether it be through residential school systems, whether it be through putting us on reservations that were completely off our natural hunting and fishing rights and farming privileges. It is really disheartening to just watch the fabric of Canada being destroyed. And day after day, and people just ignoring it. So I think the job of Idle No More is to wake people up so that they're not idle. And trying to explain that. Some days it gets a little overwhelming. Some days you're just like, oh my goodness. But if you speak to one person that day and you can change their mind, I think it's a huge step in the right direction.
That's the first important baby step, right? I mean, you know, the Russian Revolution was started by 4 or 5 people. That was a bad example of movement, but I mean, to take the example of a good revolution, let's look at the civil rights movement in the United States. I mean, the spark for that was when one black woman named Rosa Parks decided, you know what, I'm not sitting at the back of the bus that day. And look at the enormous change that came about because of that. So reaching one person is key. I mean, I woke up last year, and you know, thank God that, as I said, to reiterate my point I made earlier, I mean, thank God that 3 First Nations bands in this country have decided to stand up against the federal government.